does forgiveness play within the process of healing? And where are you within that process of forgiveness?
My default setting much of my life was to wake up in the morning and resent the world. That hasn't come easy to me. Forgiveness has to do with the more you realize that you're okay, the more you realize that what happened then doesn't have to define your present and your future. Well, if you're not wounded anymore, if the wound is healed, then there's nothing to forgive.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
So I find your work and you to be full of intention. And that includes the title of your book and the words that you have chosen to be in the title of your book. And as I've had the privilege of excavating the book, the words and the definitions of the words have undergone a significant upgrade. And I think that upgrade, thanks to your intention and rigorous work, helps to give people a lot of agency around these topics that we are going to discuss. So, to start with normal, can you expound a bit upon the societal conditions that we have begun to accept as normal?
There's an interesting word that has come into currency fairly recently, which is to normalize something. Well, what has to be normalized? Something that in the first place wasn't normal to start with. And in the modern world, so many things have become normalized, in other words, assumed to be natural and inevitable and perhaps even healthy, that actually are inimical to human health and human development, to human joy, to human advancement. And these normalized concepts and structures very much provide the scaffolding of our current society, of our current culture. So, for example, it's assumed that it's normal for people to be selfish and competitive and aggressive. In fact, it's even posited as those qualities are representing of human nature as such. But if you look at it from the point of view of evolution, we never would have become human beings, nor would even have any possibility of existing, had we been individualistic, aggressive, and selfish. In fact, the norm was to live communally. I'm talking about for millions of years that hominins or pre-humans existed. And the very hominid creatures, such as our own species, have been around for multiple hundreds of thousands of years. All throughout that time, aggressive, selfish individualism would have meant the absolute impossibility of survival. So what was norm is communal living, communal raising of children, communal setting of intention, communal ways of finding sustenance. In our society, we've normalized the opposite. So what is the norm in our society is completely abnormal from the perspective of human evolution and human needs. In another sense, people who suffer physical or a mental illness are considered abnormal. They have some abnormality. But actually, if we look at it scientifically, those illnesses, whether of mind or body, are very often, not always, but most often, normal responses to what are abnormal circumstances. So for example, a woman with severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder has double the risk of ovarian cancer. But her PTSD symptoms are normal responses to traumatic circumstances. A study just this week that showed that in the aftermath of an episode of racism, a person's immune system and hormonal apparatus undergoes immediate negative changes, which can lead to disease, and in fact it does. But those are normal responses to what, from any human perspective, is an abnormal stress. So what I'm saying in short is that we have normalized circumstances and attitudes that are thoroughly abnormal when it comes to human nature and human needs and human evolution.
Yeah, I will resist the urge to engage with you around this whole notion of survival of the fittest and how we've understood the word fittest. But as you've just described, we seem to have this delusion that fittest is somehow competition. But as you say, it is actually our ability to cooperate flexibly at scale. So let's probe the topic of trauma more specifically. Now in the book, you delineate between trauma and the trauma-inducing event. Can you untangle that a little bit?
Sure. So, as a former English teacher, I pay a lot of attention to the meanings of words and the origins of words. And trauma itself is a Greek word for wound or wounding. So in this case, a psychic wound. So the trauma, in other words, is not the event that induced the wound, but the wound itself. So I do go into some of my own history in the book, and as a Jewish infant, spending my first year under Nazi occupation in Budapest, Hungary, there were lots of traumatic events in my life. But those events were not the trauma. The trauma is the wound that I sustained in terms of anxiety, in terms of a view of the world that was rather morose and negative, in terms of the belief that I wasn't wanted or loved, and then the adaptations that I make to those beliefs to make life livable. So trauma is not what happened, which is a good thing. Because if the trauma is what happened, then there's nothing you can do about it. There never not will have been a Second World War. There never not will have been genocide. There never not will have been the death of my grandparents in Auschwitz and the near demise of myself and my mother and father. That'll never not have been. So if that was the trauma, well, one is doomed. But if the trauma is the wound that one sustains, the psychic wound that one sustains internally, that can be healed any time. So it's very important to make that distinction. The trauma is not the event. The trauma is what happens inside you as a result of the event.
And specifically, when you talk about wound, the root of the word trauma, you can make a comparison between a psychological wound and let's say a physiological wound, like you get a cut, when you're a little careless in the kitchen or something like that.
That's right.
But it's a helpful analogy when we talk a bit about how that wound can and may heal.
Sure.
Can you pull on that thread?
Sure. So if you look at the metaphor, the analogy of a physical wound, first of all, as long as it's open and unhealed, it's very raw and sensitive and painful. So, the example I often give is I get yourself to tap yourself on the shoulder and it doesn't hurt at all. But if you imagine that there's a raw wound there, there's no clothing, the skin is bare, and let's say there's a burn there, so that the top layers of the skin are burnt off, so that the nerve endings are close to the surface. And interestingly enough, we have a word for that. We call those people thin-skinned. The nerve endings are very close to the surface. You touch them on that wound, it just hurts. Now this happens in people's lives, that they're touched on their wound, their psychic wound, and they react like they've just been assaulted. But in fact, the touch may have been very light. It's the wound that's very raw. And so this is where we talk about people getting triggered, which I could talk about the metaphor of the trigger as well. So that's one characteristic of a wound, that it's raw and it's painful and it's highly sensitive, and one is very reactive when the wound is touched. Now the other aspect of a wound, and both of these apply to psychic trauma, is the scar tissue that forms over it. Now scar tissue protects us, protects the wound, it binds the flesh together, but it's got certain characteristics. It's insensitive because it doesn't have nerve endings in it. So one of the aspects of trauma is we disconnect from our feelings. It's not flexible, it's rigid. So that our responses become inflexible and rigid. We lose what is called response flexibility. So we respond in, the more traumatized we are, the more rigidly and the more predictively we react in certain inflexible ways. And we can't even think outside those boundaries. Scar tissue also doesn't grow in a healthy way. So that people who are severely traumatized, or to the degree that they're traumatized, they have difficulty growing emotionally. So very often when you say to an adult, or somebody says to you, "Don't be such a baby," it's not necessarily a pejorative. It's a description of how you're still reacting as if you hadn't grown emotionally. And I know that personally. I mean, in my 70s, I'm quite capable of reacting like a baby, and I'm not being critical of myself. I'm just saying that in those areas where you haven't grown emotionally, or when temporarily you've lost contact with the more mature circuits of your brain, you're going to react like a baby or like a toddler, which means you haven't, at that moment, the growth that you've done doesn't show up. So these are then the characteristics of a wound, whether you look at it from the point of view of a raw sore or from the point of view of scar tissue.
There's a chapter in the book where you talk a little bit about your dialogue with Eve Ensler, or known as V.
Yeah.
And I found it very illuminating around the nature of illness and disease. That's another word in the title, so I bring it up. And we'll spend some time hopefully connecting trauma and illness or disease. But in this particular chapter, you go to some great length to explain the nature of disease as something very different than what modern Western allopathic medicine has pegged it as something that you have. Can you unwind your definition of disease?
This is one of those serendipitous insights that came to me as I was writing the book. You know, which is, book writing is interesting because you're constantly, your mind is already constantly unfolding and exploring new subjects that you never thought you'd touch upon when you first started writing the book. But at some point, something became very clear to me that as a physician, I had this idea of disease that was very static and very undynamic. And it shows up in how we use language. So we say, I have multiple sclerosis, or I have ADHD, or I have cancer. Well, that language implies something. It implies that there's this thing called ADHD. There's this thing called multiple sclerosis. There's this thing called cancer, which has got a nature of its own and is independent of the person who has it. So I have this book, or I have this cup. It's a thing. I can pick it up, I can put it down, I can use it, I can not use it, I can give it away, keep it. When somebody's diagnosed with, say, multiple sclerosis or any illness, they're told by the physicians, here's your disease, this is this thing, this is what it does, this is what the prognosis is, this is what its course is going to look like. That's assuming that the disease has got a life of its own and it's a thing apart from the person in whom the disease show up. Now in my conversation with V, what occurred to both of us is that that's not the nature of illness. It's actually a process. that process unfolds in a particular individual. Illness doesn't interrupt your life, it manifests your life. And there's all kinds of scientific evidence to show how illness is not something that shows up all of a sudden. It's a long-term process, very much connected to what happened to you even prenatally, and birth and childhood. And that the identifiable symptoms by the time the diagnosis arrives are only the more explicit manifestations of a long-term process that really has to do with what's happened to you in your life and what dynamics have animated how you relate to yourself and to your life. It's not a theoretical distinction, it's a practical one. Because if disease is a process that manifests your life, it also means that if you gain agency over your life, you can affect the process.
Yes.
And there are so many documented examples, including people that I've talked to in the book, who they changed the process of their life. Their disease naturally changes because the disease is not a thing with a life of its own. And we all know of these people who have been given terminal diagnoses and 30 years later they're still alive. Well, I'm not saying those examples are common, but the very fact that they exist tells us that this idea of disease as a thing is a fantasy. You take somebody like the physicist Stephen Hawking, who was diagnosed with ALS, this thing called ALS, and he was told you got 2 years to live at age 20. And 55 years later or so, he died as the world's most well-known physicist, having made incredible contributions to our understanding of the universe. So clearly there's a process going on there that medical practice doesn't recognize. I should also say here that I have to make a distinction between medical practice and medical science, because science has shown the process
Yes.
and how it works. Medical practice doesn't recognize it. It's a strange dichotomy.
Yeah, it's almost taken 100 years now since quantum mechanics and
Yeah.
particle physics and all
Yeah.
of this science that essentially pointed to the notion that the world is not fixed,
Right.
that it is not a thing
Yeah.
that is unchangeable,
That's right.
but it is dancing and in vibratory interrelationship with itself. And of course this is speaks to our mutual interest in Buddhism and notions of dependent origination and life as an interconnected web or spontaneously emergent, as in the Taoist tradition. But here we are now 100 years later from some of the greatest discoveries of the early 20th century, just now on the cusp of putting our thumb on all of these fields of emerging study like epigenetics and neuroplasticity and the microbiome that constantly show us that life is process, that every interaction between an organism and its environment can be adaptive or maladaptive.
That's right.
And yes, we've heard of some of the more like sensational recoveries, like our friend Anita Moorjani, who had a near-death experience and then all of a sudden went into remission from a very stage 4, what we dub it, cancer. But this doesn't have to be that extreme.
No.
That anyone along any part of their journey can recognize that they're in process and adopt certain kinds of protocols and behaviors and self-work that can be adaptive to that process.
Well, Anita's book, the title is very telling, isn't it? Dying to be me.
Yeah.
And literally what she says is that she had to nearly die to become truly herself, because she discovered, as a result of this direct near-death experience, she had sort of this flash of illumination that she had never been herself all her life. Because in order to fit in with her family and the cultural expectations, she had to give up her sense of herself. So she literally had to die almost to become herself. Now, that's my general observation of chronic illness, is that virtually, not not everybody, but virtually everybody with chronic illness. I say not everybody because there are some diseases that are significantly or almost 100% genetically determined.
Right.
One that runs in my family is muscular dystrophy. If you have it, you'll have the disease, regardless of what kind of personality you have.
Yeah, sickle cell.
Yeah, but those are rare.
Yeah.
Very rare in the population. So in most chronic illness, in my work as a family physician and palliative care physician, and later on in addiction medicine, I did notice that the people prone to chronic illness are people that at some point in life, for no fault of their own, had to disconnect from themselves as the impact of traumatic influences.
Mm-hmm. That scar tissue built up.
And then the disease comes along and very often acts as a wake-up call. And what people often discover is the path back to themselves under the, you might say, compulsion of the illness. And so in that sense, no, I don't recommend that way of learning. And one of the reasons I write the book is so that we can learn these lessons before our body forces us into the kind of illumination that Anita had to experience. Mm-hmm. But much short of those dramatic and life-threatening conditions, people can pay attention to their bodies and learn what the bodies are trying to tell them and draw the right conclusions. And it's always about, you're not being yourself here. Mm. You know, it sounds simplistic, but I've got decades of experience and observation behind it, not to mention multiple studies that tend in the same direction. And again, what's remarkable is the degree to which medical practice almost militantly ignores all that evidence.
Yeah. So if illness and disease exist on a spectrum, what is healing?
By the way, that spectrum is another reason not to be so arrogant about calling some people normal and other abnormal, because as far as I can see, we're all on the spectrum. Yeah. Well, so if the essence of trauma is a disconnection from ourselves, which it is, a disconnection from aspects of ourselves, then healing, again, to look at word origins, comes from an Anglo-Saxon or German Anglo-Saxon word for wholeness. So if trauma is disconnection and disease is the physiological manifestation of the disconnection, then healing is becoming whole again. Which means, or I shouldn't say becoming whole again, more accurately probably recognizing our wholeness. You know, in addiction, there's an interesting phrase, recovery. And again, if you look at word meanings, recovery means to find again. Now you ask anybody who's recovered, what did you find? They'll say, I found myself. Yeah. Which means that whole self was never lost. It just got obscured and lost to our awareness. So wholeness and healing is the recovery of the awareness of our wholeness. And in that sense, wholeness doesn't always mean cure.
Right.
Some people discover wholeness and they're very grateful for it, but their illness is too far advanced for them to be cured. And this is where, and I'm not recommending this to anybody, but I've often had the experience, especially working in palliative care, that someone would say to me, you know, Doc, this illness that's about to take my life is the best thing that ever happened to me. And you wonder, why would anybody say that? Well, what they meant by it, it helped them to discover themselves, which they considered to be more precious than anything else, even the continuation of life itself. Now again, I don't advocate for it, I don't recommend it, but I'm just telling you that I've made that observation many times.
Yeah. I think Dostoevsky wrote, "Are we worthy of our suffering?" And of course, when Viktor Frankl wrote his book, he outlined three different places in which man can find meaning, I should say, humankind can find meaning in work, in our connection, in our relationships, and in our suffering. And I wanted to ask you, kind of along those lines, something personal about the nature of healing. I know that you lost your grandparents in the Holocaust, and I believe, I read in the book, well, that you had an opportunity to connect or commiserate with one of the descendants of Goering.
Bettina Goering, who was the grandniece of Hermann, Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most monstrous representatives of the Nazi regime.
Yeah. And I know that you also tell the story about Edith Egger, a psychologist, who I believe returns to the place of residence of Hitler.
Yeah.
And forgives Hitler.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, what role does forgiveness play within the process of healing? And where are you within that process of forgiveness?
Well, I tell you, it's been quite a journey, because no more than 4 or 5 years ago at the most, probably 4 years ago, I was part of a group getting ketamine training, you know, and we were injected with the substance, 12 of us, and each of us had a minder as we lay there on the mat, and the ketamine took me wherever it took me. And in the middle of it, I just screamed out loud, "I hate the world!" You know, not much forgiveness there, you know. But it was clearly this deep resentment in me. And my default setting, much of my life, was to wake up in the morning and resent the world, which is it's clear where that came from, you know. How could I have felt otherwise as an infant, you know? Conscious forgiveness, in the sense that Edith Egger performed it, of going to Berghof in the Bavarian Alps and forgiving Hitler, by which she meant not that it's okay what he did, but that she releases the resentment for the past that she carries inside her, because she doesn't want that to constrict her experience of being alive in this world, and her experience of fully enjoying this life that she worked so hard to create for herself. So it's letting go of that resentment. That hasn't come easy to me, but it has come, and it is coming. And I actually think that forgiveness has to do with the more you realize that you're okay, the more you realize that what happened then doesn't have to define your present and your future, which is really the healing of trauma. Well, if you're not wounded anymore, if the wound is healed, then there's nothing to forgive. So forgiveness, so forgiveness for me isn't, like it was for Edith, a conscious act. Maybe at some point it will be. For me, it's more about the release of that resentment that one holds because of the pain that one still has over what happened a long time ago. So I think forgiveness for me is very much connected to healing and just letting go.
Yeah. I've heard you say, and I've read this as well, is that everyone is dealing with some aspect of trauma. We are all somewhere on this spectrum, and that we can be listing towards healing or listing potentially towards illness and disease. If you were to be able to give a message to people, to empower them, to give them agency, to every day wake up and move towards healing and away from disease, what would that message look like?
Just to change the language a bit, I cannot give anybody agency, by definition.
True.
Okay. I can help them wake up to the potential of agency within themselves. And what I would say to people is that every instance of perceived helplessness and lack of agency on your part, every moment of being carried away by emotions as if a flood had just carried you away, every instance when something is a bit off and you notice that it is, now rather than dismissing it or judging yourself for it, you got curious about it. Why did I react that way? Not why did I react that way, which is a judgment, but I wonder why I did react that way. I wonder, why did I feel helpless? I'm actually an adult human being. I'm not an infant anymore. So this sense of helplessness that I have. When I have an opinion that I'm afraid to express because I'm afraid people won't like me. Even when a medical doctor, an expert tells me something that doesn't feel right to me or that I have some questions about, but I don't utter my questions or I don't state my objection, what is holding me back? That's the pathway towards agency. So to me, the pathway towards agency lies through this compassionate curiosity about one's responses and reactions to the world and one's emotions. Just be curious about everything. And that promotes agency in two ways, because first of all, the answers will begin to emerge, but secondly, you'll begin to notice who's the one asking the questions. Well, that's the you that you don't even know existed. So to me, the path to agency lies through curiosity.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the scale of the societal problem as it relates to mental illness, depression, and addiction?
Yeah. Well, 3 weeks ahead of this conversation, in the New York Times, there's a front page headline about a teenager who was on 10 different psychiatric medications. 10. Which is a trend in the United States. And literally millions of kids are being medicated for all kinds of conditions, including them being medicated with antipsychotics, not for psychotics, but not for psychosis, but to control their behavior. This, despite evidence that even in adults, those antipsychotics can have negative effects on the brain. So it's an uncontrolled experiment in fiddling with children's brains. And the number of children being diagnosed with ADHD and anxiety and depression is going up. Anguished articles in the New Yorker and the New York Times within the last few months about the rising tide of childhood suicides.
Yeah.
As far as addiction is concerned, last year there were more than 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States. I mean, more people died in 1 year of overdoses, double the number that died in the Vietnam, Afghan, and Iraq wars put together. This is in 1 year. So one can hardly overstate the scale of the crisis. The problem is people are not looking at the systemic causes. Psychiatry still focuses on the biology of the brain as being the culprit, not recognizing that the biology of the brain actually reflects an interaction with the environment. So that whether it's adult or children, we got to look at the systemic causes that are driving people in those directions. And we're not doing that.
Yeah, there's a proclivity just to prescribe or over-administer like an SSRI. Yeah. It's just like, okay, well, we've done some analyses and it looks like the biochemistry of the brain needs more serotonin or whatever.
Well,
and simplify.
As someone who's taken SSRI and has benefited from it,
yeah,
I'm not going to argue wholeheartedly against or wholesale against the judicious use of medications, but I can also tell you that the theory of lack of serotonin causing depression is complete bunk. There isn't any evidence for it. And so, yeah, I benefited for a while from SSRI, but it's the same as if you go to a party and you're kind of socially shy and you have a drink and all of a sudden you become the life of the party. Does that prove that your social anxiety was caused by a lack of bourbon in your brain, and so you can't argue from the potential benefit of medications to causation. There's no correlation whatsoever.
Yeah. What does a trauma-informed society look like?
Well, from my perspective, from the closest discipline, for me, of course, is medicine. And the average medical student to this day, does not receive a single lecture on psychic trauma and its multiple physiological and mental consequences. So they're working blind. It's astonishing. This is despite multiple decades of research and literally tens of thousands of papers. So a trauma-informed medical system would indicate that when a person comes in for, say, multiple sclerosis or depression or ADHD, they'd be offered the appropriate treatment, whatever that may happen to be. But then a conversation would also ensue about what in your life may have led, what is the process in your life that may have led to this particular symptom or this particular constellation of symptoms that we call a disease. And the correlation between, say, addiction or ADHD or multiple sclerosis for that matter, and trauma and stress could not have been more definitely established than it already has been in scientific research. And yet the average person who goes to a physician with any of these conditions is never asked about trauma, nor are they helped to heal the trauma. So that's medicine. The legal profession, oh my God. The law, most people in our jails are traumatized people. Yeah. And that's not even controversial. And yet, the jails punish the manifestations of trauma without really having, they call it a correctional system, but nothing gets corrected for most people. The way people are treated, the solitary confinement, the harsh conditions, the punishments, the lack of decent nutrition, they're all designed almost to exacerbate rather than to heal the trauma. So a trauma-informed correctional system would actually help people correct their life course. And where it's done, it's very effective. This isn't theory. It's in pockets, it's done here or there, but it's generally not done in the system. And the average lawyer and judge and prosecutor understands nothing about trauma. They don't even know the concept for the most part. Yeah. A trauma-informed educational system, boy oh boy. If teachers were trained in human development, in child development and brain development, and if they understood that these dysfunctional childhood behaviors and learning difficulties are very often the outcomes of trauma, what a different educational system we could have. What if the educational system was designed to promote healthy emotional and brain development rather than strictly the inculcation of a certain curriculum? If a political social system understood the implications of trauma and did its best to avoid or correct them, the possibility for a humane society would be infinite. Mm.
So it sounds as if across our judicial system, our medical system, our politics, the way that we build our economy, that we need a wholesale reimagination of our systems and structures from a vantage point of upstream, but also through the lens of compassion. And this is something that you touch deeply on in the book, is the topic of compassion.
Well, one of my teachers, A.H. Alma, says that only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. I mean, people are so scared and they're so agitated and they're so divided and they're so hostile sometimes and so isolated that for them to wake up to the truth, there needs to be a lot of compassion around that we offer one another, and especially to those that we don't agree with. Yeah, so if there was compassion all around, and of course the interesting thing is, compassion is not only not strange to human nature, but is the very essence of it.
Yeah.
I mean, when do you feel better? When does anybody feel better? When they grasp something aggressively and competitively and selfishly? I mean, even look at this grasping movement. It's a tension, it's a constriction, isn't it? As opposed to giving, you know,
Yeah.
which is immediately expansive. When do you feel better? Physiologically, you
Yeah.
know? In other words, that's our nature.
Yeah, giving is self-care.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune Podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.